God of War is widely regarded to be one of the best video games of the past decade. In 2018, Santa Monica Studio delivered a soft reboot/sequel into the God of War franchise, sending it in a brand new direction in what was at the time a pivotal point in their history where they needed to innovate and change up their formula. And it would be the understatement of the century to say that they did just that. God of War was universally praised and even won Game of the Year in a year that had the likes of Red Dead Redemption 2 as competition. Its deep and profound story, in-depth and challenging gameplay, and masterfully crafted worlds are some of the best in gaming still to this day. Now, I have a bit of a complicated relationship with this game. I played it when it came out in 2018, but I never finished it because a little game called Red Dead Redemption 2 came out later that year and basically took over my life. Although I knew from my time with the game that God of War was absolutely incredible, I was a Red Dead fanboy through and through, and that game consumed my life when it came out, which meant for whatever reason I just hadn't revisited God of War again. That is, until now. God of War has been by far my most requested video on this channel, so I dusted off my copy and actually finished it this time, and revisited what is undoubtedly a masterpiece of a video game. So in this video, we're going to dive deep into the story, the gameplay, and the worlds of this incredible game, and take a deep dive retrospective look into the timeless perfection of God of War. Now, when it comes to God of War, it basically excels in all areas as a video game, but the story is a massive standout. Now, context for this video, I had dabbled in previous God of War games, so I was relatively familiar with the story, but I don't consider myself overly knowledgeable of the God of War lore. But again, I was familiar enough with many things this game calls back to, because God of War 2018 is undoubtedly a heightened experience if you are familiar with what came before. But it's also clear it doesn't rely on it, and the story does a great job on filling you in on Kratos' past. The story of God of War is all about actions having consequences, parenthood, and I'd even argue it's about trust. It also touches on the endless cycle of violence, which is something that The Last of Us Part 2 revolved around thematically, although I think this game actually does it better. To be fair though, that theme isn't exactly front and center as it is in The Last of Us Part 2. The story of God of War ultimately is about a father and son, Kratos teaching Atreus how to be a god, Atreus teaching Kratos how to be a human. It's fantastic. One thing I love about this game's story though is it's incredibly simple on the surface level. You go on a journey with a mourning father and son as they spread the ashes of the mother on the highest peak in the 9 realms. Very simple idea, very simple goal. But it's not necessarily about the end goal, it's about the journey, the dynamics of the characters, and how you grow to care over time that shows the magic of this story. So, let's go through that story. The story picks up with an older Kratos in Midgard with his son Atreus. After everything that went down with the Greek pantheon, he's in a new land in the realms of Norse mythology, trying to live a new mortal life. But that life has come crashing down on him. His wife Faye has died shortly before the events of the game. Now, we never see or meet with her, which the first time I played I actually held against the game. As I had no connection to the mother, why should I care about the journey if I didn't know this person? But little dumb old me just didn't really get it. You don't need to have seen her to be invested. The investment comes along the journey where you start to care for Kratos and Atreus, and by the end, you're right there with them hoping they achieve their goal. We see Kratos cut down a tree to light the funeral pyre, but that tree had a protection spell on it. Having cut it down, it allows this meth head looking guy to enter their home. This is Baldur, the main antagonist of the game, and the son of Odin. A god that essentially can't die because he can't feel anything due to a spell put on him. Kratos and Baldur duke it out and Kratos wins the fight, at least for now. So him and Atreus then set off to spread Faye's ashes at the highest point in Midgard, and the epic journey begins. It's here we really start to see that although father and son, Kratos and Atreus are very different. Kratos has a hard time connecting with his son and is extremely hard on him. This is important because the entire backbone of this story is the connection between these two characters, how it improves, how it fades, and then how it improves again. It's clear at the beginning of the story that Faye was the more involved parent of the two, large in part because Kratos has kept his past a secret. Atreus doesn't know that his father is a god. Before the journey, Kratos tests Atreus when they go hunting. Atreus injures a boar who just so happens to be a friend of the Witch of the Woods, who becomes incredibly important in this story. She agrees to help Kratos and Atreus because she herself misses her son, which again becomes very important later in the story. The journey continues and Kratos and Atreus meet the world serpent Jormungandr, a friendly beast so big he can wrap around the world. After the encounter, we meet Brok and Sindri, two dwarves who created the Leviathan axe, and I've got to say, I absolutely love these two. They are low-key the MVPs of this game. Kratos and Atreus continue their way to the summit of Asgard, but are blocked by a black breath. The witch appears again and tells them they'll need the light of Alfheim to progress further. Now, something I've found with this story is your end goal is always extremely close, but things happen that continue to sidetrack you that keeps the story going in unexpected ways. Now, I can see how this frustrates some people. Personally, I think it's interesting to have the carrot of the end dangled in front of you continuously for it to just end up further and further away the longer you progress throughout the story. Nothing is ever as simple as it appears. The witch then takes us to Yggdrasil and then to Alfheim to retrieve the light. When Kratos finds it, he's greeted with a vision of his wife, but is pulled out of it by Atreus, much to his frustration. Now, this moment is great because it teaches us a few things. One, it gives us heavy character work for Kratos and how much he misses his wife despite his hardened masculine facade, but it also shows us that there is a lot more going on with Atreus, as he fends off multiple elves single-handedly as Kratos was in the vision for a long time. They then use the Bifrost to go back to Midgard and clear the Black Breath with the light. We then get to see nice moments with Atreus lighting a lantern in his mother's name, and we start to see signs of Kratos letting his guard down around his son. It's little moments like this that, despite never meeting Freya, we just start to jump on board with Kratos and Atreus' journey. This story does an incredible job at making you care to pay tribute to a character that you never even met. It's really powerful storytelling. We then save Sindri from a dragon attack, and as a thank you, Sindri gives Atreus mistletoe arrows. Atreus' quiver strap breaks and Kratos uses one of the mistletoe arrows to fix it. Now, this is one of the most important moments of the entire story, and where it goes in the climax that can easily go overlooked. Kratos and Atreus then reach the summit. They find out that Baldur is already there, along with two other people, Magni as well as Modi, aka the Sons of Thor. Once Baldur and the sons leave, Kratos talks to Mimir, who was trapped here by Odin, because he suspected him of being an ally of the giants. It's there we find out that this isn't the highest point in the Nine Realms, that's instead in Jotunheim, but there's no way to get there. But Mimir might know of a secret way, so in order to take him with us to figure it out, Kratos beheads him and takes him back to the witch to reanimate him. We then see the witch notice Atreus' mistletoe arrows, and she absolutely freaks out and makes sure Atreus destroys all mistletoe he sees in future, to which he reluctantly agrees. But remember, Kratos paired Atreus' arrow quiver with mistletoe from one of the arrows, so he still has that on him. This is very important later in the story. Shortly after this, it's revealed that the witch is Freya, aka the wife of Odin, although she absolutely hates him. Odin imprisoned her on Midgard, which explains why she was pulled back from Alfheim earlier. It's also here where Kratos gets a little hypocritical, as he hates gods and she concealed this from him. But as she makes it very clear to him, Kratos is doing the exact same thing with Atreus, which basically just puts him in his place. Mimir then joins Kratos and Atreus on the journey, and I have to say his addition to the game is fantastic. He's a talking encyclopedia for Norse mythology and great comic relief. He's honestly kind of the glue that holds the journey together. Kratos is a man of few words, so without Mimir, the in-game dialogue would have basically just been Atreus talking to himself and Kratos grunting. So Mimir really does carry a large part of the dynamic of these characters. Mimir then talks to the world serpent, but not before he eats the statue of Thor on the lake, which comes into play later. We then get sent in the direction that we need to go, which is to get a piece of a chisel left in the corpse of a giant that Thor himself killed. As they do, the sons of Thor reveal themselves again and Kratos successfully kills Magni, but Modi escapes. Shortly after Modi appears again, and due to some choice words about Atreus' mother, Atreus in a fit of rage taps into some of his dormant Spartan rage, but he can't handle it. Instead of Kratos fueling his hatred of gods and taking care of Modi, he takes Atreus back to Freya to help him. Now, at this point in the story, you really start to get truly invested in these characters. Now, I know a lot of people get annoyed by Atreus, but I love him, so this moment in the story really had me locked in like no other. And it's here we learn Kratos has to go to Helheim to find the heart of the Bridgekeeper. Helheim is basically hell, but cold, and his Leviathan axe will not work there. So with Atreus temporarily out of the picture and in a life-threatening situation, Kratos puts the love of his son over his hatred of gods and the concealment of his past to return home to get his Blades of Chaos. The Blades of Chaos remain as a symbol of his past that he's been trying to hide for years, especially from Atreus. Kratos is putting the safety of his son above himself, which feeds into parenthood as one of the main themes of the game. It also symbolizes how he's dealing with the guilt of concealing Atreus' god status from him, which is ultimately what is causing his sickness. After succeeding in Helheim, Kratos sees visions of his father Zeus as a form of torture that this Norse hell puts on its inhabitants. And it's one of many examples of this game filling in Kratos' backstory in interesting ways. Kratos then returns to Freya and Atreus, and he is then cured. His illness has come as the result of his subconscious fighting his true nature as a god, as Atreus believes he is simply a mortal. Realizing this, Kratos comes clean on his past and tells Atreus of his true nature.
I'm a god, boy. From another land far from here. When I came to these shores, I chose to live as a man. But the truth is, I was born a god, and so were you.
After this revelation, Atreus honestly turns into a complete dick. Now, when I was playing through this part of the story, I was like, this is a bit of a massive shift for Atreus. Yes, he's just been dealt a life-changing revelation, but he starts to treat the dwarves like shit. And I was like, no, that's a bit of a leap for me. But then again, you stop and you think about it. This is a child that's just been told he is a literal god. It's really not that big of a leap for a kid to go on a power trip like this. We then continue on the journey to find a way to Jotunheim. We end up in the temple of Tyr, who is the Norse god of war, but essentially the polar opposite to Kratos, as Tyr was more intent on protection and peace. We find a black rune in the temple, which combined with the chisel from earlier, theoretically, will allow us to travel to Jotunheim. On the way back to the summit, we cross paths with Modi again, but this time he's been beaten within an inch of his life by his father Thor. Atreus, who is still on a power trip, kills Modi against Kratos' instructions. Kratos then tries to teach Atreus one of the biggest themes of the game, that being actions have consequences. Therefore, killing a god has consequences, which obviously leads us into the next game.
Nobody cared about him anyways. What's the difference?
There are consequences to killing a god!
Why? How do you know? How do you know?
Watch your tone, boy.
When we reach the summit to go to Jotunheim, Baldur is also there. When things get heated, Kratos and Baldur fight and break the archway to Jotunheim in the process, and Atreus, continuing to be the absolute worst, attacks Kratos amid the scuffle. Baldur then attempts to kidnap Atreus to take to Odin, but Kratos stops him and ends up sending all three of them to Helheim. All three characters see visions of some of their most traumatic moments, which leads to revelations for all of their characters. We see Atreus start to learn the error of his ways, and he slowly reverts back to normal. We see Baldur fighting with his mother, who is none other than Freya, the witch in the woods, which explains a lot. It explains why she was willing to help Kratos and his son when she has such a complicated relationship with hers. It also creates a problem for when Freya realizes Kratos and Baldur are at severe odds with one another, but more importantly, it contextualizes Baldur's curse, as Freya was the one who put the spell on him with the idea of protecting him, but she didn't account for what it would actually mean for him. It also turns out that Mimir knew who the witch in the woods was the whole time, but she hexed him so it slipped his mind. This is the reason why he never told Kratos about who she really was. We then get a vision of Kratos killing his father from previous games, and the dynamic shifts for a second, and it's Atreus that has to help keep Kratos on track with the mission. After escaping Helheim, they end up in one of Odin's secret chambers, where we find Tyr's eye. The giants of Jotun trusted Tyr that much that they gave him the gift of sight, which Mimir realizes he also has. So he unlocks the hidden scriptures, but keen-eyed viewers will notice that Mimir has been missing an eye the entire game, and according to Brock and Sindri, the eye is in the Thor statue. That very same statue that the world serpent ate earlier in the story. So they venture into the belly of the beast to find it. On their way out, something happens to the serpent which forces it to eject them out. We find out that Baldur was beating the daylights out of him, and it's here everything starts to come together. Freya also arrives in this moment, which means all key parties for the story are here in this moment. Kratos tries to implore some wisdom onto Baldur as he sees himself in him given his past. He knows where vengeance can lead you better than anyone, and insists on sending Baldur down a different path. I really love when stories make a conscious effort to run clear parallels between its protagonists and antagonists that stem far beyond good guy good and bad guy bad. To see conscious effort put into the two that bind them together despite how different they are is awesome. And I think although they have limited interactions, these two work extremely well as protagonist and antagonist in this story. But despite the advice, Baldur is still intent on killing Freya, so Kratos intervenes and we have a massive boss fight in which Freya is constantly trying to stop. When it ends, Baldur punches Atreus in the chest, but something happens. Because the mistletoe arrows that Atreus was given earlier in the story that ended up being used to fix his arrow quiver, well, Baldur just punched straight into it, which liberates him of the spell Freya put on him. This also explains why Freya was so quick to get rid of Atreus's mistletoe arrows earlier in the game. Like, the writing in this story is just so damn good, man. Despite the curse being lifted, he still wants to kill Freya for the past 100 years he's endured, but Kratos simply can't allow this to happen. So Kratos and Atreus team up together in an absolutely chilling moment and beat Baldur. In a fit of rage, Kratos continues to beat Baldur relentlessly, to which Atreus steps in, reinforcing the lesson he learned after Modi's death. He tells his father that he is beaten and is no longer a threat. Despite Baldur being beaten, he still wants to take Freya's life though, to which she is happy to oblige if it means helping him find closure and peace to his torture. But Kratos, who is intent on stopping the cycle of violence given his past experiences, stops him and ends it all there. The only problem is, Freya, who is struck with grief over Baldur's death, condemns and promises all manners of hell on Kratos. It's here Kratos comes completely clean to Atreus, on his past, that he killed his father, everything. But Atreus expresses that he's worried by the seemingly inevitable fate of being a god, that being sons killing fathers and the likes. But Kratos assures him that the two of them will be the gods they choose to be.
Is this what it is to be a god? Is this how it always ends? Sons killing their mothers? Their fathers?
No. We will be the gods we choose to be. Not those who have been. Who I was is not who you be. We must be better.
We then finally head to Jotunheim to fulfill the goal of the entire story, but before we do, Atreus finds murals all over the walls near the summit. Etched into these walls are the entire events of the game displayed accurately. Everything Kratos and Atreus have been through. Faye foresaw it all, because it turns out that she was one of the Jotun. She was Laufey, so when Baldur came to their homestead at the start of the game, he was actually looking for Faye, not Kratos. There's also another mural which showcases Kratos' death in the arms of Atreus, but we don't linger on that for too long. Kratos has a moment of pure liberation after this. The binds of his arms are released as he has nothing to hide anymore. They then walk to the summit of Jotunheim in an absolutely incredible moment, and they spread the ashes of Faye finally. This is honestly one of the most satisfying moments I've experienced in a video game story ever. I loved every single second of this moment. Before we roll credits though, Kratos tells Atreus that he was named after a Spartan warrior that he admired, but Atreus was known to the giants as Loki, the god of mischief, trickery, and deception, which spells interesting implications for his future, which is obviously explored in Ragnarok. Credits then roll, but if you return back home, you do get an extra ending. After some well-earned rest, Atreus has a vision of someone arriving to their home. That someone is none other than the god of thunder, Thor, setting up the events of Ragnarok. This story, man, is honestly just phenomenal. Normally, I have a small gripe or two with a great video game story, but I'm really struggling to find one to nitpick here. If I was to nitpick something, because I have to pick something out, because there's going to be that one smooth brain TikTok kid that says I'm glazing the story because it's actually good. So I've got to find a little bit of a nitpick just to keep them off my back. I would say that the story is very MacGuffin based. You do spend a lot of time going somewhere to grab a MacGuffin and then going somewhere else to grab another MacGuffin. But as far as complaints go, it pretty much begins and ends with MacGuffins for me. I'm just so glad I revisited this game when I was a little older and could probably appreciate it a little more than I would have if I completed my playthrough when the game came out. The Last of Us is my favorite game of all time, and I knew this game took some inspiration from it, and playing through the story in its entirety now, it's very clear to see where and how it does so. You've got two people who are forced together to go on a grand adventure and learn to love and trust each other along the way. It's very similar, so it checks out that this story really resonated with me given my fondness for The Last of Us. But God of War's story still forges its own identity in the process, which should not be forgotten. I would also be remiss to ignore Bear McCreary is a massive reason this story and this game worked. I don't think we can really praise this guy enough for helping to create the tone and feel this world needed. And without him, this story simply wouldn't have packed the punch that it did. I love that he decided to keep the score simple for this game with few notes because Kratos is a man of few words. This guy, probably the MVP of God of War. Overall, though, this story is just masterful. There's simply no other way to describe it. It's one of the best video game stories ever told, and based off story alone, I'm not surprised it won Game of the Year in 2018. The gameplay of God of War is honestly some of the most satisfying gameplay I've come across in any game. I think we can all agree throwing the Leviathan axe around is about as satisfying as it gets. I must admit, picking the game back up again after all these years, I was surprised by just how Metroidvania-like it was. Also, how Souls-inspired it could feel at times. It really feels like this game took inspiration from all of these other games, combined them all together to create something of its own. A large portion of the gameplay in God of War is spent exploring. You spend a lot of time traversing linear paths to get to certain areas to complete your story missions or side quests, aka favors. Now, I think this largely works here as the combat encounters you get along the way can certainly catch you by surprise, but the puzzles in this game are genuinely great, at least in my opinion. I have seen people over the years call this game God of Puzzles and say it in a negative way, and I can definitely understand where they're coming from. Puzzles are a large part of the gameplay here. You spend a lot of time figuring out how to progress to the next area, and sometimes it can be challenging until you have the moment of realization that you're actually a complete moron and it was 10 times easier than you thought. But there are certain puzzles that do require you to think a little bit, and I appreciate that personally. Other games that have similar level design to this game, such as Jedi Fallen Order or Jedi Survivor, I could often get frustrated by those puzzles and find them to be a bit of a chore, but I was actively enjoying going out into the world and engaging with them here. As you progress throughout the game, you unlock new abilities that allow you to complete certain puzzles and unlock new areas. Because of the Metroidvania design of the game, often you'll go down certain pathways and there will be things you can't complete, but you can revisit later. Now, this does mean backtracking and retreading the same ground, which is something I don't really like when it comes to games with this kind of level design, but I think they did a reasonable enough job of speeding up the backtracking if fast traveling isn't available to make it so it's not a complete nightmare. But let's talk about the combat. The combat in God of War is absolutely incredible. For the first half of the game, I found the combat to be pretty enjoyable, but it wasn't until I learned about Valkyries that I was basically forced to learn just how deep the combat ran in this game. When you spend multiple hours getting your ass beaten by a Valkyrie, you really do start paying more attention to your approach with your build, because this game really does allow you to have the freedom to approach combat how you want. You of course upgrade your skills as you'd come to expect. You upgrade your Leviathan Axe and Blades of Chaos as the story progresses, and on top of that you can upgrade your shield combat, your Spartan Rage combat, as well as Atreus as a companion. But then you can pick up runic attacks for your axe or blades, which act as a special high damage ability that can make or break a fight. You use them at the right time and they can be a massive help. If you use them at the wrong time, those difficult enemies will make you pay for it. There's also a lot of gear in this game. It's very RPG-like at times. Between your skill points, you have a really diverse experience in your playthrough. You can focus on certain attributes for Kratos that range from strength, runic, defense, vitality, luck, and cooldown. There's just so much depth here, and believe it or not, it wasn't the story that actually hooked me early on in the game. It was the progression, which for a game with such a strong narrative is actually mind-blowing to me. I can't believe that's what got me hooked. Now, to aid alongside combat, you can't not talk about boss fights. Now, the boss fights tied to the story, to be honest, I actually thought were quite easy. Like, I genuinely had more issues with random, unnamed sub-bosses I found when exploring the world than I did mainline boss fights with the likes of Boulder. The mainline story boss fights feel like a mainline story boss fight with quick time events and checkpoints mid-fight. But when you're away from that, I think that's where the game's combat in a boss fight sense truly shines. The Valkyries being a prime example of that. One thing I love about the combat approach here is that you can play aggressive, you can play conservative, and at times with certain fights you really will have to slow yourself down, remain patient, wait for your moment. But then the game still lets you know that it's a God of War game and you can just go absolutely ballistic. Especially on higher difficulties against difficult enemies, you sometimes really have to play slow and patient and really wait for your moment. As I mentioned earlier, I spent hours on just one Valkyrie boss fight. And yes, whilst I thought about taking a long walk off a very short pier dozens of times, I actually really enjoyed the challenge of it. Those few hours went by really quick, and despite the fact I could have just walked away and come back later at any time, I didn't want to. The core gameplay is that enjoyable that I wanted to keep going. I haven't been so frustrated by a boss fight in my life before, but I also hadn't enjoyed one as much at the same time. It's truly a unique experience that this game gave me that I've never had before, and I've played a lot of games in my time. Now, the ways you can approach encounters in this game are also very player specific. People play this game very differently, and I've noticed that by watching other people's YouTube videos on this game. I watch their gameplay and I'm like, you can do that? But I also watch someone else's gameplay and it looks like they don't know that they can do half the things I do. It's really weird how different people play this game. Depending on how you like to play as a player, depending on your build, certain approaches work better than others. It's basically up to your playstyle and build if you should favor the Leviathan Axe, the Blades of Chaos, or both. Also, whether or not you should use Atreus, whether or not you should use Resurrection Stones, what runic abilities you use, when to trigger your Spartan Rage. Like, there are so many factors that can help give you a unique experience here. Using Atreus, for example, for me personally, it varied from fight to fight. His special ability in some instances was an absolute must for me, and I wouldn't have been able to defeat enemies without it. But against some of the Valkyries, I often found the ability just made it harder for me to spot the unblockables. So again, Valkyries in general, I barely used Atreus at all, which to be honest is probably why it took me so freaking long. But there were some enemies that I also found the Blades of Chaos to be useless and the axe overpowered, and vice versa. Now, this wasn't from a damage perspective, as I know certain enemies you're supposed to use the blades and some you're supposed to use the axe because of frost and fire and all that sort of stuff, I know. But I mean in the general flow of combat. I found the axe was better for one specific tanky enemy and the blades were just better for crowd control. Like, depending on your enemy, the approach can just be so different, and then combine that with your playstyles and you really can have a unique experience. It's honestly no wonder when in combination with the incredible story that this game won Game of the Year when it had Red Dead 2 as competition, which many people consider to be literally the best game ever. I will be replaying this game many times in the future on Give Me God of War just for the enjoyment of the gameplay alone. The worlds of God of War are without a doubt incredibly well designed, look fantastic, and are a joy to explore. Considering this game is now 6 years old as of the making of this video, you could honestly fool anyone into thinking this is a brand new game. This is still one of the best looking games out there. And the diverse worlds Santa Monica managed to bring to life here are still mind-blowing. Now, although there are 9 realms in the game, you don't go to all of them. Instead, you go to 6, those being Midgard, the main hub world of the game, Alfheim, Helheim, Muspelheim, Niflheim, and Jotunheim. Now, each world is very different. You've got icy landscapes, fiery landscapes, and locations with a bit of everything. Niflheim is even covered in a toxic mist, meaning you can only stay there for so long, which is actually a really cool idea, to be honest. Like, there is more than enough variety in these realms to keep you interested even after dozens and dozens of hours of playtime. Now, Midgard as the main hub world is obviously the one that got the most attention, so the detail is just absolutely insane. But there are sections of this game that you barely see at all, or even just for a few minutes, that have crazy levels of detail put into them. Like, hats off to the developers at Santa Monica here. The attention to detail, despite the player barely spending any time in certain locations, is insane. Now, spread across these worlds is an absolute bucket load of things to do, to find, and to just explore. I want to say straight off the bat, the side missions, more commonly known as favors, are some of the best uses of side missions I've ever seen in a video game. Side missions in many video games these days are honestly kind of pointless and just serve as a way to gain XP and give players something to do away from the main story and just pad out the runtime of the game. But each side mission in God of War feels very deliberate and well thought out. No side mission that I came across had me wanting it to just be over so I could just get my reward. Each of them served a purpose, whether that be fleshing out Atreus, Kratos, or Mimir with dialogue, or teaching us more about Norse mythology, and overall just adding to the world building. I wouldn't deem any of the side missions really to be pointless filler. There's always at least something profound going on. By the time you finish them, the reward is basically just the cherry on top. Another example of the side content in the game having depth behind it is with releasing dragons. You'll often get backstory into the dragon itself. Yeah, you get some cool rewards, but the fact the dragon's side content is completely optional is crazy to me. I didn't realize you could even do it until late in my playthrough, and I would have been so mad if I missed this. You also have smaller side content to chip away at as you traverse the world, such as Odin's Ravens and an abundance of chests that offer hack silver and other treasures, which you of course need to make upgrades to your weapons and abilities. How you access these chests and collectibles is tied to your progression. You need certain arrows from Atreus, you need the Blades of Chaos, and the list goes on. You also sometimes need to really explore every nook and cranny of surrounding areas to find seals to unlock certain chests. On top of that, there are various secrets to find and hidden areas to uncover. Spread around the world, there's also treasure maps you can find for some extra adventure too. We of course referenced this earlier, but you can also find a bunch of Valkyries to fight. Some of them are relatively easy, some of them will make you question life itself. Now, whilst not being completely open world, God of War certainly tricks you into thinking it is at times. The worlds are designed in a way where you have a very open central area and you can branch off into more linear sections of the world and just get lost in them. You get the best of wide open spaces, but you of course still get that Metroidvania-esque level design. Despite that not being my favorite form of level design, I think it still works well for the game they crafted here. What can I even say really? God of War's worlds are just beautifully crafted, rich with things to see and do, lore littered throughout, and honestly, are just a joy to explore. Again, all of that despite my lack of fondness for Metroidvania-esque level design. But despite that gripe, I think it speaks volumes as to how well this game is designed that I can still have as much fun exploring these worlds as I did. God of War is honestly still to this day a masterpiece. God of War is right up there alongside The Last of Us as one of the best narrative games I've ever played. But God of War is far from a one-trick pony. It manages to excel in just about everything it does, and the only time I really had any gripes with the game were minor moments in the story, or if the game was just too difficult for me to just go crazy killing everything in sight with Kratos. Most of my complaints about this game are purely aggressively subjective complaints that are totally on me and aren't really a fault of the game itself. This game is absolutely masterful. It beat Red Dead Redemption 2 for Game of the Year for a reason. And as a Red Dead 2 fanboy, admittedly, who did put God of War to the side in 2018 to immerse himself into Rockstar's world, to this very day, I still think this game is more than worthy of its prestigious mantle. This is one of the best video games ever made, make no mistake. Its story is deep and profound, the gameplay is satisfying and in-depth, and the worlds are incredibly brought to life. The perfection of God of War will remain timeless.